Mara Steele stepped into the bar, seeking nothing more than a moment of quiet, but the gang of bikers spotted her immediately. They thought intimidating a lone woman would be easy. Their confidence, however, crumbled the moment one of them tried to use force. What happened next left everyone in shock. The road stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by the thick darkness of the night. The hum of tires against the pavement was steady, rhythmic, the only companion to the driver behind the wheel. The dashboard clock flickered, showing it was close to midnight. There was still enough fuel, but the exhaustion of the road weighed heavy. A neon sign appeared in the distance, flickering weakly against the black horizon. The letters had long since lost their full glow, leaving behind a broken, stuttering message barely readable against the night. The parking lot was half full, lined with motorcycles, a few semi-trucks, and an old, rusted pickup that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The place had the kind of presence that warned outsiders to keep driving, but she didn't. Mara pulled into the lot, her car rolling to a stop near the edge. She sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel lightly, surveying the building through the windshield. The exterior was what she expected: weathered wood, windows coated in a thin layer of dust and grime, a doorway worn from years of boots kicking it open. Places like this were always the same. They smelled of cheap beer and burnt grease, filled with men who had nothing better to do than drink and trade war stories about the roads and the fights they'd been in. She had been to enough of them before to know what to expect. The moment she stepped out of the car, the sound of cicadas filled the air, buzzing in the summer heat. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of spilled fuel and asphalt, mixing with the ever-present dust that lingered on roads like this. The night was still, too quiet, the way places like this often were, waiting for something to break the silence. She walked toward the entrance, her steps steady, unhurried. She wasn't here to make a scene. She wasn't here for anything except a break from the road, a cup of coffee, and maybe a moment of quiet. But she could already feel the eyes on her before she even touched the door. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, a mix of old yellowed lights and a flickering TV in the corner playing a boxing match no one was watching. The air smelled of sweat, tobacco, and fried food, thick with the kind of atmosphere that had soaked into the walls over the years. The wooden floors were scuffed. The bar itself was lined with the same regulars that could probably be found here every night, their places marked by worn-out seats and half-empty glasses. Behind the counter, a man old enough to have seen 1,000 nights like this was wiping down a glass. His face was lined, his expression unreadable. He barely acknowledged her entrance, only glancing before returning to his routine. This was the kind of place where people minded their own business, unless given a reason not to. She moved to the bar, took a seat, and rested her arms loosely on the counter. The chair creaked slightly beneath her as she settled. The bartender approached, still wiping the same glass, and looked at her. "Coffee," she said. He nodded. No small talk, no hesitation, and turned to pour. The heat of the bar pressed around her, thick and heavy. The murmur of voices was low, carrying stories she had no interest in. The clink of glasses, the scrape of boots against the floor, the occasional burst of laughter, it was all background noise. She focused only on the coffee, the warmth of the cup against her fingers as she lifted it, taking a slow sip. She could feel the shift before she saw it. The change in atmosphere was subtle at first, laughter fading slightly, voices lowering, an unspoken awareness filling the air. The feeling of being watched became stronger, more deliberate. She didn't turn immediately. She had been in situations like this before, knew what it meant when a room full of men suddenly paid attention to the one person who didn't fit. From the corner of her eye, she saw them, a group seated at a corner table, all wearing the same faded leather jackets, the same patches sewn into the fabric. They had the look of men who had spent more nights in places like this than anywhere else. Men who belonged here. They weren't drunk, not yet, but there was an edge to the way they sat, the way their eyes followed her, the way they spoke just a little too loudly for it to be anything other than intentional. One of them leaned forward, said something to the others, and they laughed. Another nodded in her direction, a smirk spreading across his face. They weren't just watching her. They were waiting for something. She took another sip of her coffee, still not turning, still not reacting. It was always the same in places like this. Men like that always thought they owned the space around them. They thrived on the idea that someone like her, someone alone, someone who didn't immediately acknowledge them, was an opportunity, a challenge. She heard the scrape of a chair, the heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor. Someone had stood up. She didn't have to guess who it was. The bartender didn't say anything. He had probably seen this kind of thing 100 times before. Maybe he already knew how it would end. She waited for the moment they decided to close the distance. It didn't take long. The heavy thud of boots against the wooden floor was deliberate, unhurried, a movement meant to be heard, to signal presence before words were spoken. The air in the bar remained thick with the usual sounds, clinking glasses, murmured conversations, the distant hum of the jukebox struggling to play through old speakers. But beneath it, something shifted. A current ran through the room, a silent acknowledgement that something was about to unfold. Mara didn't turn immediately. She didn't need to. She could already map out the space in her mind. The way the men at the corner table had shifted their weight forward. The brief pauses in conversation from the nearby regulars. The way the bartender kept wiping the same spot on the counter, pretending not to see. She knew the type of men who walked like that, with the slow confidence of someone who had never had to question their control over a room. The first one reached her. He slid into the stool beside her, his presence thick with amusement. She could smell the alcohol on him. Not overpowering, but enough to suggest he had settled into the kind of buzz that made men like him feel invincible. His leather jacket creaked as he leaned onto the bar, his elbow resting on the counter as if he had just casually decided to start conversation. Well, he said, his voice coated in that familiar tone of someone who thought they were charming. Didn't expect to see someone like you here. Mara didn't acknowledge him. She took another sip of her coffee, her fingers relaxed around the handle. The second man arrived a moment later, his footsteps heavier, more deliberate. He positioned himself on the other side of her, effectively bracketing her in. His mistake.